Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's a Friday morning on March 20th. Here we are at the verge of spring. How exciting! So today I want to talk about something that is kind of it's not really on the front pages of the newspapers or anything, but I thought it would be useful. And I'm just going to introduce it by talking about a little bit, biographical aspect of myself. I'm kind of an adventurous person, and I've traveled a lot. I live in Thailand now, although of course I'm a U.S. citizen, and I would say a loyal U.S. citizen. I don't wish the United States any harm. I want it to the best, and this article will talk about how to uplift, millions of American people. But there was a book that I read called Zen Baggage, which is about an American guy who visited China and traveled around China. And he met a Tibetan monk at a certain point. This is towards the end of the book. And the Tibetan monk said, if you want to become enlightened, leave your country. So, in other words, when you live in one place for a long time and you've never seen anything else, you don't really know how other people think. You don't know their attitudes, and you often may have kind of skewed or misinformed attitudes about people. So, and my attitude has always been that I want to be friends with everybody. So that makes me a little bit unusual. But here I am in Thailand, and the city that I live in, Chiang Mai, is kind of a crossroads for people from many different countries. I just had a good hour long conversation with a woman from China yesterday. We were talking about what life is like in China, and I'm planning to have kind of meditation meetings it's an open library, actually. It's a business, but it's an open library. And so I'm going to go sit there on Sunday afternoons, and maybe some people will join me. But anyway, so that's a Chinese person. But I also have a lot of friends from other countries. And particularly, I met one woman here from Ukraine. That was about 2 years ago or so. And now she's back in Ukraine because her mother is older and she wants to take care of her. And I also have friends in Russia because I've visited Russia several times. And people have, we're raised with this idea that Russia is a really bad country and everybody there is, well, maybe it's the people aren't bad, but the government is terrible. So I'm going to be addressing that issue directly in this article. But the point that I'm making here is that you can actually learn a lot by talking with people. And so why do I bring all this stuff up? This is kind of an introduction. I bring it up because I was talking with my friend in Ukraine on the we use we use an app, and we can't talk by regular phone. It would be way too expensive, probably impossible. And she was telling me that she had just bought something called a Khrushchovka, which was an apartment building that was built during the era of Nikita Khrushchev, I guess, and apparently built between 1957 and 1963. Millions of apartments were built cheaply and fast because they had a major housing crisis. And now here she is. Maybe her house was built, her apartment was built in maybe 1960 or so. Here we are, it's 2026, and those Khrushchevka apartments are still there in Ukraine, no less, which was a part of the Soviet Union. And and she bought it probably pretty cheap, and she fixed it up, and now she's got a nice little place to live. It's not glamorous, but it's a place. It's her place, right? Now it turns out it turns out that I was in Russia last year, and I had been invited to stay with some people in a dacha, which is a kind of a country house outside of Moscow. And after staying there, I asked my friend, an American friend actually, he's a journalist, and I said, hey, I need a place to stay. And he said, sure, you can stay here for a night, but then, my apartment's a little small. You'll have to find a hotel, but you can stay here for a night. And guess where guess what his apartment is? It is a Khrushchevka. So, and then I was talking with this other guy. He's a Zen practitioner like myself, Russian. Um, and I'm going to go visit him and probably go meditate with his friends in Moscow. And so I said, it's really, I'd rather not, stay in hotels because they are more expensive and you're just another person in a hotel. I'd rather be with people where you can actually interact with them and you get to know people and you make friends. That's a really nice thing to do. There's an app you can have called couch surfing. And couch surfing means, when you need a place to stay, you go on their website, you say what your trip is, and you look for people who are open to hosting guests, usually from other countries, and you read a little bit about them, and you can do that. So anyway, somehow it took me a while to find it. I was looking for a Zen community in Moscow or in Russia, and I found this guy, and we struck up a conversation, and I went to a Zen meeting, with him and his friends, I guess a year or so, maybe 2 years ago, and so I contacted him and I said, hey, I'm looking for a place to stay because hotels in Moscow are pretty expensive. And besides that, I'd rather hang out with, some of your friends. It'd be nice for a Zen person like me to hang out with other Zen people in their house. So he says to me, well, Eric, I'm living in a Khrushchevka with 2 kids and I don't really have room for you, but I'll see if somebody has some space and you can have a couch somewhere. But the point of this is that now I know 3 people who've lived in a Khrushchevka. These are small houses, small apartments, but they're functional. And here's this guy, Khrushchev, the Nikita Khrushchev, and the evil Soviet premier. And now, so I want to talk a little bit about Khrushchev because, he took over after Stalin died, and he's rather controversial because he really trashed Stalin big time, and a lot of people now dispute his issues with Stalin. But putting that aside, in 1962 we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were very, very, very close to having a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And John F. Kennedy, our heroic president, who had his own flaws, Khrushchev had his flaws, but they had this idea that maybe a nuclear war wasn't such a good idea. Let's see if we can work something out here. So in fact, they did work out something, and it resulted in a period of what we can call détente, which meant that relations between the Soviet Union and the United States were on a reasonably even keel for a number of years. Okay, so that's another issue about Nikita Khrushchev. But the other thing, though, is that he created this program called Khrushchevkas. So what I'm going to do is read this article. See if I can go through it here. I think I can do this. Let me find it here. Yeah, here we go. So I'm going to read through this article, and we can take it from there. So it starts off, we have a very real housing crisis. In the land of opportunity, where innovation supposedly lifts all boats, a quiet epidemic festers. Millions of Americans are one bad month or one rent hike away from the street. Consider the numbers. As stark as they are surreal. On any given night, in 2024, 771,480 people were counted as homeless, an 18% jump from the prior year and the highest tally since tracking began. Now, I'm taking advantage of Grok's, research capabilities here. He says this is not a rounding error. It's a city the size of Seattle's. People sleeping rough or in shelters, while the rest of us just scroll past the headlines about record stock markets. Then you layer on substandard housing. Those 6.5 million households, roughly 16 million souls by typical sizes, living in units the American Housing Survey politely labels moderately or severely inadequate, missing working plumbing, heating, or worse in 1.65 million cases. Then add the rent crunch, where 22.7 million renter houses, home to an estimated 55 million people, now fork over more than 30% of their income just to keep the lights on and a key in the door. A grim record for the fourth straight year. Nearly half of all renters. Think about that the next time someone calls housing a market correction. The irony is almost poetic. We boast the world's largest economy, yet the system that produced trillion-dollar tech firms somehow can't house its own workforce. Families choose between groceries and roofs. Seniors skip medicine to avoid eviction. Young professionals bunk with roommates into their 30s, while developers chase luxury towers. This isn't misfortune, it's math. Rents climbed 38% since 2019, while incomes limped up only 28%. That's a 10% difference. So you're losing purchasing power just between 2019 and 2026 on rent. The result? A pressure cooker of stress, health crises, lost wages, and kids shuffled between schools. Untenable barely covers it. It's a slow-motion, social, societal cell phone that drags GDP, inflates emergency room bills, and erodes the very stability we claim defines us. Worst of all, the fixes are embarrassingly within reach and embarrassingly ignored. Scale up proven tools, targeted vouchers, zoning that actually allows apartments near jobs, modular construction that slashes building times and costs. These aren't utopian dreams. Pilots in scattered cities have housed thousands affordably and fast. Yet year after year, the gap widens as if policymakers are playing Jenga with people's lives while muttering about personal responsibility. America doesn't lack money or ingenuity, it lacks urgency. Until leaders treat housing as infrastructure on par with highways or broadband, or healthcare for that matter, the numbers will keep climbing. The irony, thicker, the human cost steeper. A quick, affordable remedy isn't charity. It's the bare minimum maintenance fee for a functioning society. The alternative, more tents on sidewalks, more families rationing heat, it isn't just untenable, it's un-American. Time to build, subsidize smartly, and fix it before the next count makes today's horrors look quaint. Now consider the Soviet-era housing solution, the Khrushchovka. Millions of spare but livable apartments were built in an economy far smaller than the US economy. How much would it cost to solve America's housing crisis using this model and compare with the cost of, say, an aircraft carrier or a F-35 fighter program? In the shadow of Kremlin's grand promises, Nikita Khrushchev didn't wait for perfection. The cruel dictator. The cruel dictator ordered the factories to churn out millions of boxy, 5-story concrete panel apartments known as Khrushchevkas. Between 1956 and 1963 alone, the Soviet housing stock nearly doubled adding over 500 million square meters and delivering separate flats to 1 in 4 urban families. By the early 1980s, Russia alone had 290 million square meters of the things, enough to rehouse tens of millions from barracks and communal kitchens in an economy that in 1960 was worth roughly 233 billion nominal GDP, or about 43% of the size of Americans that year. The units were tiny, often 40 to 60 square meters, Spartan, and built to last a few decades, but they were warm, private, and crucially, produced at industrial speed for pennies on the dollar. Fast forward to 2026 America. GDP is roughly $28 trillion and the world's undisputed heavyweight. We face a documented shortage of 7.2 million affordable and available rental homes for the 11 million extremely low-income households who need them most, on top of a broader 4 million unit supply gap that has left the homeless, the substandard housed, and the rent-gouged scrambling. To solve it Khrushchev style, mass-produced, no-frills prefab blocks, factory lines humming, land assembled by fiat or clever zoning would require something like 7 million compact units of 500 square feet each, a generous upgrade from the originals. Modern modular and panelized construction in the U.S. already clocks in at about $80 to $160 per square foot installed for basic homes. At true Soviet-scale production, dedicated plants, standardized designs, minimal finishing, government land and utilities, a realistic all-in figure lands about $100 to $150 per square foot. That pencils to $50,000 to $70,000 per apartment in pure construction, maybe $80,000 to $120,000 once you add in foundations, hookups, and basic site work at volume discounts. Multiply by 7 million, it comes to about 560 to 840 billion total, let's say 700 billion. Spread out over a crash 5 to 7 year build out, land acquisition and permitting would be the real variable, but eminent domain light, zoning reform, or surplus federal property could slash that item dramatically. Now stack that against the toys we do buy without blinking. One shiny new Ford-class aircraft carrier runs $13 billion, enough at these numbers to roof over 100,000 to 160,000 families. The entire Ford program, already north of 120 billion, could have housed extremely low renters in California and Texas combined. And the F-35, this is a fighter plane that people have often wondered is really worth the money. Its lifetime cost has ballooned past $2.1 trillion, 3 times the Khrushchovka fix for planes that still struggle to stay mission ready while we argue about tents on sidewalks. The irony is thicker than panel grout. An economy 120 times larger than the one that pulled off this miracle in the 1960s somehow finds it, quote unquote, impossible to replicate the feat, yet writes blank checks for floating airports like aircraft carriers and trillion-dollar hangar queens. We possess the factories, the engineer, the modular technology, and the idle industrial capacity. All that's missing is the political will to treat housing like the national security infrastructure it actually is. We spend trillions on bombs, and we can't even build houses. A Khrushchev-scale push, federal prefab mandates, streamlined codes, union-scale wages for speed, wouldn't just end the tents, the moldy basements, and the 30% plus rent traps. It would be the cheapest, fastest, most visibly patriotic stimulus imaginable. Jobs in every state, dignity restored, GDP boosted by stable families instead of emergency room visits and shelter budgets. Instead, we keep choosing the expensive, photogenic hardware of the military over the boring, functional roofs. The math isn't even close. The remedy isn't utopian. It's embarrassingly doable, embarrassingly overdue, and, given the alternative of ever-growing tent cities, embarrassingly un-American to keep ignoring. Time to rank up the cranes. The Soviets managed it with slide rules and central planning. We can surely do it with 3D printers and a little urgency. Now, here's another item that I thought would be interesting. I asked, and I've kind of known this, but I wanted to get it more documented. How much did Soviet citizens pay for rent as a percentage of their income? And how many houses were simply given away to Soviet citizens for free? So all of you who are paying rent and watching this or reading this, whatever, pay attention here. In the Soviet Union, housing was treated as a fundamental right rather than a market commodity, with the state owning the vast majority of urban apartments and allocating them through waiting lists based on need, square meters per person, workplace priority, or family circumstances. Rent for these state-provided units was deliberately kept extremely low through heavy subsidies, making it a tiny fraction of household income compared to capitalist systems. This is Grok. This is Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, in his AI program. He's writing this stuff. Okay. Historical accounts consistently place Soviet rent, including basic utilities in many cases, at, you ready for this? 3 to 6% of an average family or household income across much of the post-war era. In the 1930s, workers spent 4 to 5% of their family budget on rent. By the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras, Brezhnev was the last really stable leader of the Soviet Union. From the 1950s, this is an area of a timeline of about 1950s through the 1980s. So by the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras, when mass construction of Khrushchevkas and Brezhnevkas peaked, figures hovered around 3 to 5% or 4 to 6%, with some sources citing a maximum of around 4% towards the end of the USSR, unchanged in nominal terms since 1978. For example, a 3-room apartment might cost 10 to 20 rubles per month in the 1970s to 1980s, while average worker salaries were 100 to 200 rubles higher for skilled or dual income households, and a family might pay 5 to 10% at most for a multi-room suite. These rates covered only a sliver of actual cost. The state absorbed the rest, viewing housing as infrastructure like roads or schools. Get that? The government is paying much of your rent. Terrible, terrible idea. BlackRock would be shocked. The apartments themselves were not given away for free during the Soviet era in the sense of outright ownership transfers. Citizens received lifelong tenancy rights to state-owned units at nominal rent, with strong protections against eviction and the ability to pass occupancy to family members. Ownership remained with the state, enterprises, or local Soviets. The Soviets meaning the local councils. Free often describes the ineffective lack of a meaningful purchase price or a higher ongoing cost, but it was subsidized rental allocation, not property deeds. So they didn't actually own their houses, but they lived there virtually for free. Mass privatization came only after the USSR's collapse. In Russia and other successor states, like Belarus, for example, or Kazakhstan, I suppose, or Ukraine. Starting in the early 1990s, under laws like the 1991 Russian Federation privatization push, sitting tenants could privatize their apartments for a free or at symbolic cost, often just administrative fees. This transferred ownership of millions of units, essentially giving away the Soviet-era housing stock to occupants. By the mid-1990s, a huge share of urban families became outright owners overnight, though this applied mainly to those already in qualifying state or municipal flats. Cooperatives or rural homes had different paths. The irony persists. An economy far smaller than the USA's delivered near universal urban shelter at negligible cost to residents, trading market efficiency for social guarantee. So let me repeat that. Their economy was far lower than it is in the United States, and yet they were able to provide, very, very inexpensive housing to people, trading market efficiency. That is where Wall Street can buy up houses and then charge rents whatever they feel they can get away with, versus a government-owned house where you had specific social guarantees. You couldn't get thrown out. Your rent wouldn't become unaffordable. Now, wait times could stretch for years or decades for prime spots, and quality varied, but the burden on pocketbooks was microscopic by global standards. In contrast to America's current rent traps, the Soviet model prioritized access over profit, proving that affordable can mean radically different things depending on who sets the rules. So there you have it. I think this tells a story about how we could actually deal with this housing problem. And it's kind of, unfortunate that the United States doesn't do some kind of program like that. We spend, Trump is talking about raising the military budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in 1 year. That's $500 billion raising the military budget each year from 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion. And this article is talking about for 700 billion taking care of the housing problem. So the housing problem could be solved in less than 2 years if the US government had the will to do it, or the politicians had the will to do it. So the question is, what are we going to do about this? It's unconscionable to me that the so-called richest country in the world goes around, bombing the crap out of country after country, and yet we can't even house our own people. It's really ridiculous, and it's inexcusable. So thanks again for listening to this. I hope this will kind of stimulate people's ideas. As one of the commentators named Caleb Mopman says, we need a government of action that works for working families, and I will add to that, not a government of action that works on sending Marines thousands of miles away into harm's way. We don't need that. So that's what I got to say here. And thanks again for listening. And I'll be back soon. There's more stuff that I want to talk about. And we'll just keep going. And, we need to educate the people. This is one of my billboard, my information billboard T-shirts, which I hope you might consider buying one of these things. Not that I make a ton of money on it, far from it, but just, if everybody walked around with one of these T-shirts and people would say, yeah, that's a good idea, then when Trump comes and decides that we need to have a military draft, people can show up in front of the White House with one of these T-shirts and say, forget it. Okay, well, that's it. And thanks for listening. And please, support my channel with a like or a comment, or, you can subscribe to Substack, or send me a few bucks from Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. So thanks again for listening, and I will catch you next time.